Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this book launch hosted by the World Socialist website and Mering Books. We're gathered together today to discuss the book, Was There an Alternative? And the author, Vadim Rogovin. The publication in English for the first time of Was There an Alternative? 1923 to 1927 marks something of a historic event. This is a significant work that is now being made available. And in our discussion today, we'll explore why and who its author was. And I think a great many really important topics will come up in the process. My name is Joseph Scalice. I am a historian of Stalinism in Southeast Asia, and in particular in the Philippines. And I'm joined today by Andrea Peters, who is a sociologist of the Soviet Union and a regular writer for the World Socialist website, and David North, who is chair of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website and national chair of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. The book that we're going to be discussing that is being launched, Was There an Alternative?, deals with the history of the emergence of Stalinism and the struggle of the left opposition in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And those who are in attendance from around the world are going to be able to ask questions of our panelists. You can do so through slido.com, that's slido.com/WSWS. And the questions posed there will then be presented to the panelists for discussion. This is a rich, dense, and complex book. And I think an appropriate way to begin our discussion today is through a brief summary of its contents and subject matter. And for that, I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Joseph. I'd like to begin with just a few words about the book that we're going to be talking about today. Was There an Alternative is the first volume in a 7-volume series by Soviet sociologist and historian Vadim Rogovin about the years-long struggle waged by the Marxist opponents of Joseph Stalin. In this work, Rogovin focuses on the years 1923 to 27, when the left opposition, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, initiated the battle against the bureaucratic monstrosity forming inside the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. Rogovin starts this work a bit prior to 1923, actually. He begins by drawing a portrait for the reader of the political situation in the Communist Party in the lead up to the conflicts of the mid-20s, and then takes the reader through the turbulence of the next 5 years, covering both the politics and the economics of the era. Rogovin's account makes clear that the claim made by both Stalinists and anti-communists that Stalin was the heir to Lenin and there was a straight line of development from Bolshevism to Stalinism is unsubstantiated by the historical record. Such a claim can only be sustained by erasing from reality the socioeconomic and political convulsions that seized the USSR and the Communist Party during the 20s, as well as hiding the facts of the final years of Lenin's life when he was preparing to move against Stalin and the tendencies that he represented. Rogovin's account exposes the methods used by the Stalin faction to secure power, the suppression of political discussion, the political elevation of hand raisers, the pursuit of privileges for the elite, the destruction of the political culture of the Bolshevik Party, and the use of skullduggery, machinations, and the falsification of facts. This degeneration provoked opposition from within the leadership, as well as the Comintern and the party rank and file. It was a hard-fought battle. Because Stalin and his backers had no solution to the economic problems facing the USSR or answers for their critics, they had to resort to driving them into illegality. All of this is carefully and movingly documented in Rogovin's book. He draws on primary sources, including communications between members of the party, the notes of secretaries and other observers, the stenographic records of meetings high and low, reports from different branches of the Communist Party, and other internal documents, as well as articles, speeches, and commentary published in the press at the time. Readers will hear the voices of figures like Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, who was fighting for an end to the oppression of Stalin's opponents within the party. They will hear the voice of figures like Grigory Zinoviev, who admits to the behind-the-scenes dirty tricks he participated in. And they will voice of from party cells, from the provinces, for an honest account of what is going on in Moscow. They will also hear, perhaps most importantly, the words of Trotsky, which had been unknown and inaccessible to hundreds of millions of Soviet people for decades when Rogovin published this work. It is a vivid history, and the reader can feel the drama and intensity of events, as well as the nobility, treachery, and tragedy of political leaders and ordinary people who had, over the previous 5 years, overthrown feudalism and capitalism, beaten back the imperialists, won a civil war, survived famine and intense deprivation, and were now confronting counter-revolution from within. This work has much in it, both for those new to the study of this history and those more familiar with it. We're speaking today with David North, the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website, who knew and worked closely with Vadim Rogovin. He is also the author of many works on Trotskyism and the struggle against historical falsification. David, I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us a bit more about who Rogovin was. He was born in 1937 at the height of the terror. His grandfather was actually suppressed by the Stalinists. Perhaps you could tell us something about how he came to write this work, how he formed and developed as a person who would, at the end of his life, make such an incredible contribution to the history of the Soviet Union.
Well, thank you, Andrea. I'm very pleased that we are able to bring out the first volume. Actually, we've already produced what is in his series of 7 volumes, volumes 2, volumes 4, and volumes 5. Actually, we began with 4 and 5 because they were the volumes which dealt with the most terrible years of the terror, and I knew that these were volumes that Vadim was particularly anxious be made known to the public. It is hard to believe, I must say, that some 23 years have passed since Vadim's death at the terribly young age of 61. I think everyone who reads these works must understand that Vadim wrote them under what was, in effect, a sentence of death. He learned in 1994 that he was suffering from terminal cancer, and when this was first diagnosed in mid-1994, the doctors believed that he had perhaps 3 to 6 months to live. Remarkably, and I believe this was not only a physical question, but an expression of enormous intellectual willpower, Vadim, despite a terrible illness, undertook an extraordinarily strenuous intellectual task of producing the final 6 volumes of his work, and in fact rewriting the first volume, which is now out, the volume which introduces the struggle of the left opposition. That's the first thing which must be said about this. This is a work that was produced under tremendously difficult conditions, and again, not just physically difficult conditions, but conditions which were in the environment of post-Soviet Russia extremely difficult for the development of intellectual work. It was a period of extreme political reaction, an abandonment of principles, moral collapse, an environment where all the worst features of capitalist restoration, as had been warned by Trotsky and the Trotskyist movement, were being realized. But despite everything, Vadim produced these remarkable volumes. It's hard to say where one begins when discussing Vadim Rogovin. I think it must first of all be said that Vadim was a man who contained within his personality, or expressed within his personality and his intellectual work, the full force of Soviet history. He internalized this history, he pondered it, he struggled with it, and he was determined. And I think this was an intellectual project that didn't begin in I know it was not an intellectual project that began in the 1990s. It was a lifelong goal, a mission, which he embarked on to uncover the truth of the October Revolution and to answer perhaps, well, what must be considered among the greatest questions and the most perplexing questions of 20th century and therefore of modern history. How did the greatest and most important revolution in world history, the first proletarian revolution, the first socialist revolution that brought the working class to power under the leadership of an absolutely extraordinary party, which comprised among the greatest minds of its age, greatest political leaders, led by the two most outstanding figures of 20th century history, of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. How was it possible that this great revolution, which had such vast global consequences, how did this revolution degenerate and give rise to among the most monstrous dictatorships that ever existed? A dictatorship which set about to exterminate those who had led it and to smother all the ideals which that revolution inspired. This was a question which preoccupied Vadim Rogovin from his teenage years, and he devoted his entire life to answering it. And so I think when one speaks of this work, speaks of Vadim's work, one must see this historian himself as a major historical figure and study his books in that context.
And David, how did you come to know him? How is it that your paths crossed?
Well, it's not a personal question. I mean, there's always an element of accident as to how one actually winds up meeting somebody. But I think what it represented was that the Trotskyist movement had been separated from the Soviet Union as a result of the purges, the campaigns of extermination. To be labeled a Trotskyist, to be associated with Trotsky in any way, was a death sentence under Stalin, and it was, for all intents and purposes, criminal to have any association with Trotskyists if you were a Soviet citizen until well into the 1980s. The efforts of the Trotskyist movement to preserve and defend the true legacy of the October Revolution, to expose the lies of Stalinism, to explain why and how, to use the title of Trotsky's great work, the revolution was betrayed. That task unfolded within a Trotskyist movement which was cut off from access to the Soviet Union. But that work was done. Now, in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s, when Gorbachev came to power, for the first time, a discussion opened up within the Soviet Union about Stalinism. Let me correct that, there was first there was Khrushchev's secret speech from 1956, which became known, the initial revelations of Stalin's crimes, but these were very much dealt with in the most superficial manner. The problem of Stalinism was presented largely as a problem of an individual, the so-called cult of personality, and there was an attempt to present a sort of schizophrenic approach to Stalinism. Stalin may have committed some crimes, but the system which he created was basically healthy, and it represented real existing socialism, a falsification which communist parties throughout the world defended. And there were no shortage of apologists within the academic world who sustained this lie. The Trotskyist movement had been fighting to expose this, and it was not until the mid-1980s that conditions arose for the first time where the Trotskyists, that is the International Committee of the Fourth International, was able to actually visit the USSR. I went there for the first time in 1989, and the environment at that point, it was exactly 32 years ago this month, it was quite extraordinary. There was an enormous interest in the history of the revolution. It was remarkably easy to begin a discussion with history literally on any street corner. My own experience was, I recall walking on Gorky Street, as it was then known, and there was a group of people standing around and they were talking about history. And I began then speaking about Trotsky and that they should study the history of the of Trotsky's struggle, of the left opposition, of the Fourth International. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that within about 15 minutes, there was close to 100 people gathered around listening intensely. And at the end of the discussion, I was taking down names and addresses so that I could conduct further correspondence. In fact, the International Committee did that. We founded the Bulletin of the Fourth International. We began publishing our accounts of the crisis in the Soviet Union. We made very clear that we did not believe that Gorbachev represented a progressive tendency. We warned that Gorbachev's policies were in fact nothing but the final stage of the restoration of capitalism in the USSR, and that it was, if the Soviet Union was to be saved, it could only be saved through the building of a revolutionary party that based itself on the program and principles of the Fourth International, that is, on the critique of Stalinism by Trotsky. The next time I visited the Soviet Union in 1991, the situation had changed profoundly. It was in the autumn of 1991. The intellectual environment had vastly changed. A mood of demoralization had set in, and the most right-wing pro-capitalist elements were laying the foundations for the liquidation of the USSR that took place a few months later. And but during this time, the IC was publishing the Bulletin of the Fourth International. Now, quite independent of the International Committee, Vadim Rogovin had throughout the 1980s, while working as a sociologist, intensified his own work, his research into the history of the Soviet Union, and he was determined to establish historical truth. There's two stories which he later told me about himself, which, when I speak of a lifelong mission, he told me that when he was only 12 years old, he was born in 1937, the most terrible year of Stalin's terror. His grandfather was shot in 1937, one of Stalin's victims. He had been a great lawyer in the Soviet Union of the 20s and 1930s. In fact, Vadim was very, very proud of the fact that his father had defended the social revolutionary defendants in a trial in which they were accused of inciting a counter-revolution against the Soviet regime. They were implicated in assassinations of Soviet leaders. Vadim's grandfather put up a very, very vigorous defense, and ultimately what happened was the social revolutionaries were condemned to death. The sentence was stayed with the agreement that the SR leaders would call off assassinations and there would be no executions of their leaders, a pledge to which the Soviets adhered. And Vadim was very proud of this intellectual tradition, this profound dedication to principle and justice. And of course, he grew up in this terrible environment of Stalinist repression where nothing could be said which in any way raised the question of the political differences which underlay the Stalinist repression of all opposition. But he told me that when he was 12 years old in 1949, there were these celebrations of Stalin's 70th birthday. And it occurred to him, he thought it was strange, that Stalin seemed to be the only revolutionary leader who had lived to that age, with perhaps one or two other exceptions. And so he asked his father, why was Stalin the only Bolshevik who had reached the age of 70? And his father sort of became somewhat ashen, and he made it very clear this was not a discussion that one could have, and changed the subject. The next recollection he had was the death of Stalin. And well, let me backtrack. There was one further element of that story. Yes, when his father said that to him, as he told me, a terrible thought occurred to him. And that is, Stalin is a criminal. That was the only explanation. He was a criminal, and he had murdered all of his opponents. And in 1953, when Stalin died, and the news came over the radio that the leader of the people was dead, Vadim's first thought was that somehow something good had just happened. And by 1956, he was heavily engaged both in the sociological and historical researches. Now, Vadim initially felt that when Gorbachev came to power and so-called glasnost, openness, began, at long last it would be possible to really lay bare the history of the Soviet Union and restore Trotsky to his rightful place in the history of the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, and the world communist movement. It didn't take long before he began to realize that this was not going to happen. The mood was, particularly after 1989, 1990, the mood changed. And by the time of the restoration of capitalism in the USSR in the beginning of 1992, in the terrible environment, he could witness this change in the moral, social, political, intellectual climate. He continued his work, and as what then happened, to explain how we all wound up meeting, somehow or other he came across, with his wife Galia, a copy of the Bulletin of the Fourth International that was being put out and being distributed in Russia. And we were gathering a significant number of supporters, and so when there would be events staged or exhibits at conferences, Vadim would attend them, try to pick up literature, and he read the Bulletin of the Fourth International, and then inquired of Fred Choate, who was in Moscow at the time and who had met Vadim, inquired as to whether he knew of the International Committee. Fred said he did, and through Fred, he was able to establish contact with us. He first came to Germany in 1992. He met with Peter Schwarz, who was the secretary of the International Committee at the time, still is, but he was already then the secretary of the International Committee. And it was at that point that regular contact was established. And my first meeting with Vadim took place in February 1983 in Kiev. We had a group of supporters of the International Committee in Kiev, and I had gone there with Comrade Larry Porter to give a series of lectures on the history of the International Committee. Vadim heard about this. He decided to go to Kiev to attend these lectures and to meet with me. And we met, and I must say that we found ourselves very rapidly engaged in an intense discussion of the history of the Soviet Union, the towering role of Trotsky, and the absolute necessity of initiating a campaign for historical truth against what we would then call the post-Soviet school of historical falsification. And that established a pattern. Not long after, my next trip was, I believe, in June of 1993, this time to Moscow, and we began planning, continued our discussions on the development of his planned history of the left opposition, a project which grew steadily in size and scope. what was interesting, he had completed the first volume at the time. We had many discussions. And then he told me he was going to be rewriting. There were many things now he wanted to add and change. I had not read the first volume as it had appeared. And he told me he wanted to make substantial changes to incorporate new information, ideas he now had, and conceptions which had developed in the course of our discussions. Though I must say, the work is Vadim's work. He was a man of an astonishing, a tremendous imagination. I don't think he had a discussion which didn't in some way stimulate his thinking. And so I think that the fact that he now had the opportunity to speak directly with Trotskyists, who had been deprived access to the USSR during an earlier critical period of his own intellectual development, opened up new possibilities for him. And that proved to be immensely significant in the development of his work, and it was certainly very significant in the development of our work outside of the Soviet Union.
Thanks, David. It's a fascinating history. I would be interested, I know that Vadim was both a friend and comrade of yours, and that you had extensive interactions with him. And it's clear from the story that you're narrating that here was a man who was of immense intellectual acuity, brilliant, determined. The story that you're telling of how he worked through his cancer to produce this series is extraordinary, and of great courage. But could you also perhaps provide us some insight into his personality? I know that you spent a good many evenings with him. I know in conversations that you've mentioned that he was a person of great culture. What can you tell us about him as an individual? What was he like?
Vadim? I don't know whether he was a man of enormous nobility. He had an immensely powerful presence, bearing. He was a man who was, I would not say he was, he understood the significance of the work he was doing. He was, I think the term could be used perhaps imperious. I think he was, that term was sometimes used in relationship to Trotsky. And I think he was, in that sense, imperious in the way Trotsky may have been imperious. He thought through questions with immense intensity. In that sense, he exhibited the most powerful and wonderful characteristics of a historical phenomenon known as the Great Russian Intelligentsia. There was an intensity to Vadim. Yes, he was a man of immense culture. He could recite poetry from memory for hours. I think he must have known every poem that Mayakovsky ever wrote. And when he recited poetry, it was, perhaps people have seen this one, there's a tradition of Russian recitation, which is highly dramatic. And Vadim was certainly capable of that. When he was displeased, he made it clear immediately. I used to imitate him. He would say, "Stop, stop, stop!" There were many sides of him. He was, first of all, in terms of his own personal situation, because I'm going to speak something about his moods. When he learned that he had cancer, he said, "I see nothing tragic in my personal situation. I see nothing tragic in my fate." And he didn't really speak about it very much. Later, in the course of the years that followed, we did everything we could. He did have a doctor who was tremendously devoted to him, a very fine Russian physician, oncologist, who did play a significant role in extending Vadim's life. But he didn't speak about that very much. He took it as his fate, and he had to accept that. But he was profoundly affected by the environment. And there were times when that would depress him. I can give you a number of examples of this. It would be often the case that when I came to visit him in Moscow, and And the environment was really deplorable. It had changed so dramatically. And it was not just that he felt intellectually isolated. Many of the people with whom he had worked, who had played a major role in Soviet intellectual life, now found themselves isolated. I remember at one dinner he invited a woman journalist who had written for one of the most important Soviet newspapers. And Vadim told me that she had a readership at one point of 40 million people. And now she was without any readership. The type of questions, social questions that had concerned her were no longer of popular concern. And so this would affect him deeply. And he would say, you don't understand how terrible our environment. But when the discussion, after an hour or so, began to shift to historical questions and to the fight for historical truth, that would begin to animate him. And one critical moment in that came, really it was not long, it was in the autumn of 1994. He had received this terrible diagnosis. And we didn't know what was going to happen. But nevertheless, we thought, well, let's think of the future. And I then raised with Vadim, would he be interested in coming to the United States to lecture on the question, was there an alternative to Stalinism? And he immediately agreed. Galia, his wife, who was herself an immensely talented journalist and immensely concerned with historical issues and a great source of encouragement to Vadim, agreed that this would be both important politically, historically, and also personally. So we made arrangements, so we were able to extract from the faculty at the Michigan State University an invitation. The professor who extended the invitation was not planning or didn't believe that this would be a particularly important event. He had initially planned to invite a few of his seminar students to attend this, but we initiated a campaign, and we took a picture of Vadim, put it on a poster, and said, this will be a major intellectual event, Vadim Rogovin on the history of the Soviet Union. Well, the picture of Vadim, you only had to look at the picture to realize that this would be a major intellectual event. And much to the surprise of the faculty of Michigan State University, 150 students turned out for this lecture. Now, we didn't know whether Vadim would even make it to March, but somehow when he arrived at Metro Detroit Airport, he was enthusiastic, he looked wonderful, he was overjoyed that he was finally going to be able to speak to an international and particularly an American audience. We invited him to a seminar of members in Detroit of our party. He was enthusiastic about having a chance to speak and to take questions and to answer questions. And it established a pattern. It was for him, it was, and for Galia, it was a tremendous experience. He was endlessly fascinated with every aspect of American life. And that was a pattern which continued as he went later to Britain, to Australia, to lecture. He was interested to know as much as he could about the outside world and to discuss the historical questions. And so we had lectures in these countries, and somehow Vadim, despite the very, very difficult health conditions, somehow was able to do that and also write his books. I stayed with him a number of times. You're asking about what he was like. I recall, they had a small apartment. It was like many Soviet apartments, it was multi-purpose. His bedroom became, in the evening, a dining room. A small antechamber sort of was a room where discussions took place. And much of what he wrote was written in longhand in a small kitchen on a small table. I remember I would come into the kitchen early in the morning. It was enveloped in smoke. Vadim was a heavy smoker, and you'd have to brush the smoke away, and there were papers all over the place, and Vadim was writing out longhand, and it seemed to me he had just a staggering ability to write perfect prose with absolute clarity, barely a correction, combining obviously a vast knowledge with an almost photographic memory. That's how he worked. And he continued this pattern really well into 1998. He came to Sydney, Australia for the last time in 1998 to participate in a educational congress of an educational school which was held in Sydney. He gave a brilliant lecture, and we presented to him, well, the picture you have in front of you was taken in either Sydney or Melbourne. He lectured in both in 1996, in July 1996. What I'm just relating is his second trip to Australia in January 1998, and that was the last time he was there. I think he traveled in the spring of 1998 to Israel and came back, and then in August of 1998 his health suddenly underwent a very rapid deterioration. I was able to see him one more time and had a lengthy discussion with him in his hospital on the 15th of September. He spoke, the 16th of September, he spoke at great length. It was very clear. I left the next day. We planned to meet again, but then unfortunately he died the next day. But he was intellectually active until the very end of his life.
Thank you, David. I think in this vein, we're all eager to discuss the work of this man. But before we do, I know that we have footage of a tribute that you paid to him, I believe on the occasion of his 60th birthday, where you speak to these personal qualities and to the significance of his work. Perhaps you could give us a brief, very brief, just when is this occurring? And then we can play this footage for the audience.
Well, Vadim turned 60 in May 1937. And obviously this was a milestone, which all his many friends and admirers and comrades felt must be commemorated and celebrated. In Russia, such events are taken seriously. Birthdays are major events. Certainly birthdays which are of a decade or a specific, your 50th or 60th or 70th birthday is an occasion to attempt to sum up what had been achieved or the significance of a life. There was an official event planned at the Academy of Sciences, of which Vadim was a member in the field of sociology. That was to take place on a Monday. But the day before, I believe it was a Sunday, there was to be a gathering of his closest friends at his house. And I went there. There were comrades from Germany. There were many of his closest colleagues, including one figure who had played a major role in his life, and that was an aestheticist, a philosopher of aesthetics by the name of Abner Ziess. I was later to write more about him and his role in Vadim's life in a tribute which I wrote after Vadim's death. Abner Ziess was there and made a tribute to Vadim, and then I spoke and tried to speak about how his comrades saw Vadim. That is Vadim. The picture you have is Abner Ziess. Believe it or not, the man at that time was 84 years old. He was a Marxist. He amazingly had survived. He was born in 1910. He remembered the Civil War, the atmosphere of the 1920s. He knew everyone from Lunacharsky, who was the Commissar of Education, also a genius, and of course many of those figures in philosophy and science and literature who were to be ultimately murdered by Stalin. he survived. And he did a great deal to mentor Vadim and to assist Vadim and protect Vadim. Vadim was not the most diplomatic man. He would speak his opinion, and it was often left to Abner Ziess to intervene and use whatever connections he had in the bureaucracy to protect Vadim against retribution. He was himself a very brilliant Marxist scholar, and played a major role in Vadim's life until his death in, I believe it was in the autumn of 1997, at the age of 87. So we were there. It was a very joyous occasion. Vadim was in wonderful spirits, and at some point, as is appropriate in Russia, I gave a toast to Vadim, and of a I think personal character, but certainly expresses what I and his comrades felt about him.
On Monday, I and others will have an opportunity to speak in a more formal environment. And refer, of course, to the work that Vadim has done as a historian, as a writer, as a thinker. Today, I would like to speak both for myself and for my comrades on a more personal basis.
Сегодня я хочу говорить о личном плане.
I must envy Comrade Ziess, or he has had the opportunity to know Vadim for 40 years.
Я завидую товарищу Зиссу, потому что он уже 40 лет знаком с Вадимом.
Unfortunately, I only had the opportunity to know Vadim for 4 years.
К сожалению, Дэвид только 4 года.
Partly that has to do with the fact that there is an age difference between myself and Comrade Ziess.
Конечно, есть разница в возрасте.
But there's also another factor,
Есть еще.
and that even had I been older for many decades, it would not have been possible for those who were perhaps in a position to most appreciate Vadim's work, even to get to know him. It would not have been possible.
Даже если я старше был, это невозможно было познакомиться с ним пораньше.
And only recently did conditions emerge which made it possible for members of the Fourth International to come to know Vadim.
Только в последнее время возникли условия, при которых можно познакомиться с Вадимом, членами.
But I want to say that our relationship in this period of time has not merely been one of politics.
Наши отношения — это не просто вопрос о политике.
I know of really no other person who has so powerfully represented the values, the culture, the intellectual integrity that Vadim represents.
Нет другого человека, который выражает ценности, культуру, который Vadim представитель таких ценностей.
For those of us who have had the opportunity to know Vadim, he has come to represent an inspiration and even a moral force in our lives.
Для нас Вадим — это вдохновение и наших, он моральная сила нашей жизни.
And not only is he a great man, and he is a great man.
На самом деле он великий.
He is something else. He is a very good man.
Он тоже добрый.
A genius is a genius. He was born a genius.
Он рожден, может быть.
He worked very hard,
Он очень усердно.
and of course, he developed this genius.
Конечно, он развивал.
But it is very difficult, and perhaps even more difficult than being a genius, is being a decent human being.
Это труднее, чем быть гением, быть добрым человеком.
And to preserve that decency under the most difficult conditions.
И сохранить эту порядочность при Тяжелый труд, да, трудный труд.
And that goodness and decency and devotion to principles and justice and equality is what makes Vadim such an unusual and extraordinary human being.
Доброта, порядочность, преданность, справедливости, это делает Вадима хорошим человеком.
And I'm speaking not just for myself when I say this, but for all those all over the world, in the United States and Canada, in England, in Germany, in Australia, in Sri Lanka, who have had the opportunity to meet Vadim and Galia.
Я говорю именно всех в Англии, в Германии, в Австралии, которые познакомились с Сталиным и с Вадимом.
Those of us who are here today feel very privileged to be in your company on such an important occasion.
Для нас сегодня это честь, просто честь быть здесь у вас.
We feel very moved by this occasion.
Для нас это очень
And permit me to convey both for myself and all my comrades, not only our great respect for you, but also our deep love and affection.
хочу выразить не только наше уважение, но любовь.
And even in the future, under the most difficult conditions,
И в будущем даже при тяжелых
draw
условиях
strength from the fact that you have comrades and friends all over the world in whose heart you always have a very special place.
имейте в виду, что у вас есть товарищи и друзья по всему миру, вы у нас в сердце.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for sharing that with us and allowing us to be belatedly party to these greetings. They're moving. I think we're all eager to move to a discussion of the work of this both great and good man that you were paying tribute to. And in that regard, I'd like to again present the cover here. Was there an alternative? And this has been put out by Mering Books. It is the first volume in this series of Rogovin's historical exploration of the left opposition as alternative to Stalinism. And it brings to light, as we're about to discuss, immense material that documents the crimes and betrayals of Stalinism and the principled political fight waged by Trotsky and the left opposition. No Marxist library is complete without the writings of Vadim Rogovin. They are available at mering.com. That's MEHRING.com. For the next 2 days, our viewers are able to obtain a 20% discount on the writings of Rogovin. And I would encourage you to go and avail of that. This volume, which is now made available, is for sale at 20% off, as are the other volumes in Rogovin's series. I'll come back to this towards the end and recommend several other books, including 2 books by David North, Indefensively on Trotsky and the Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century. But I wanted to bring this to your attention now. The books are available. They are discounted for a limited time, and you should purchase them. Let's turn then to a discussion of this book. Andrea, why don't you open up our discussion?
Thank you. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, Vadim is really taking up this question of the effort to equate Stalin with Lenin, which is something that the anti-communists of the world and the Stalinists of the world agree on. And in the early chapters of his book, he outlines the developing concern, criticisms that Lenin is beginning to come to with regards to Stalin's politics, his behavior. And he also is simultaneously during this period experiencing a significant health crisis. He has 2 strokes in 1922, I believe 1 in 23, and then finally dies in January of 1924. Could you talk a little bit, David, about Lenin's growing concerns and opposition to the politics and outlook of Stalin? And also, Rogovin has a very interesting chapter in which he argues that Stalin was responsible for the psychological murder of Lenin. Could you talk about what Rogovin meant by that and why he made that argument?
Well, first, as to the historical background, Vadim obviously begins his book. It's a chronological, in terms of its organization, proceeds for the most part chronologically. And he establishes very clearly that the health crisis of Lenin coincided with a deepening political crisis within both the within the Soviet, particularly within the party, within the leadership of the party, over policy. The background of this had been the introduction of the NEP, the new economic policy, which, while necessary for the purpose of reviving the economy after the devastation of the Civil War and Revolution and the previous World War. And just very briefly, what the NEP did, the New Economic Policy, or NEP as it was known, what NEP did was it sanctioned and allowed for the utilization of the market, capitalist market, in order to reestablish, in particular, the relationship between town and country, to revive economic life. The basic problem of the Soviet Union was that its industry had been shattered. It lacked resources. And the delay of revolution in Europe, the defeats of revolution in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, particularly in Germany, had left the Soviet Union isolated. This is what, of course, then itself had made necessary the reversion to NEP, which was to bring out latent political divisions inside the leadership of the party. Now, Lenin suffered his first stroke, as you pointed out, in, I believe it was May of 1922. And the chronology is important here. We're dealing actually with a very concentrated period of time. Now, in 1922, the year of the Fourth Congress of the Communist International, which was held in November, Trotsky was, to all intents and purposes, at the height of his power. He was next to Lenin, and I mean not after Lenin, but next to Lenin, the most influential, powerful, and one would say among the masses, beloved figure in the Soviet Union. He had an immense following in the working class, certainly among the youth. By the way, Abner Ziess would later tell me that he could remember memorizing speeches by Trotsky, that Trotsky gave during the Civil War. He said, they were very harsh speeches. He spoke with a tremendous militancy, and at times it could appear even cruel, but it spoke to our moods. He exemplified the spirit of our revolution. So Trotsky was at the height of his power. He was immense. He was, of course, still the leader of the Red Army. He was on the Politburo. Undoubtedly, next to Lenin, the most creative intellect in the Soviet Union, and certainly in the political sphere, but even beyond the political sphere, in the cultural sphere. Now, Lenin fell ill in May. He recovered, and he returns to political activity in the late autumn of 1922. And as Vadim explains very well, he already recognizes that in his absence, significant changes have taken place. He begins to sense a change in the political mood in the leadership. He begins to become increasingly concerned with the manner in which the Soviet bureaucracy, which is growing and growing for reasons tied up with problems in the actual establishment of a functioning society in Russia after a war, revolution, upheavals which had cost millions of lives and had caused untold damage. The bureaucracy was growing leaps and bounds. It was growing in the state, and it was growing within the party. And he was increasingly concerned about the manner in which Stalin, in particular, as General Secretary of the Russian Communist Party, was using his critical position as General Secretary to increase to an inordinate degree his own political personal influence. This now intersected Lenin's concerns, and of course, as a man who had vast political experience, who knew his party. And that was, of course, one advantage Lenin had. Lenin was the builder, he was the leader, he was the unquestioned dominant figure in that party. He detected these changes, and he also saw their relationship to critical questions of policy. And there were two major incidents which took place. Vadim concentrates on one, but they were both important. He mentions both of them. But the first and most significant was the question of the relationship between the new Soviet Union and the regions, republics such as Georgia. Lenin was immensely concerned that the new Soviet Union, which was a union of Soviet socialist states, the USSR actually had been founded in 1922, and it was an act of creative genius. Lenin was very concerned that the new USSR should not be a recreation of the old Tsarist empire, in which the nationalities, the Georgian nationality, the Armenian nationality, and so on, would be oppressed by the dominant great Russian majority. It was anathema to him. He despised Russian nationalism. In fact, many of the conceptions which he had developed on the national question, the right of nations to self-determination and so on, were very much based on his lifelong struggle against any manifestation of the old Tsarist Russian chauvinism. He became aware then in the autumn of 1922 of conflicts that had emerged between a group in the political committee of the party, particularly Stalin, and the leaders of the Georgian Communist Party, and in which it came to his attention that Stalin was conducting himself in a manner quite directly which reminded him of the worst characteristics of Tsarist officials, and he was joined in this by his close buddy, Ordzhonikidze. And it came to Lenin's attention that in the course of a political dispute with the leadership of the Georgian Communist Party, Midvani, I think was his name, Ordzhonikidze had actually physically struck him, which in the culture of the time was unthinkable in the Bolshevik Party, that one comrade would physically assault another. I mean, that was essentially grounds for expulsion. There was a very strict code of revolutionary discipline, but revolutionary honor. And Lenin exemplified that and fought to sustain that. That occurred, that he witnessed that. And he was to refer to Stalin. Somewhat later on, when he wrote about this, he used a very specific term, Zherzhe Morda. Zherzhe Morda is a character in Gogol's Inspector General, and he's the great Russian chauvinist bully. So that alerted him. There was also another political question which arose, and that had to do with the monopoly of foreign trade. To the extent that capitalist relations were being opened up within the Soviet Union, peasants, what came to be a wealthier sector of peasants, middlemen, traders, began to, in a certain sense, well, not very directly develop their own businesses, buy and sell grain and other vital commodities. They began to become a more and more substantial interest. But while that was permitted, it was absolutely essential that these neo-capitalistic forces emerging in the Soviet Union should not be allowed to establish direct economic connections with foreign capitalists. And so there was the monopoly of foreign trade. All economic relations between the Soviet Union and major capitalist countries had to be conducted through the state. The state maintained its monopoly. In Lenin's absence, that had been simply overruled and ended When Lenin learned about this, he turned to Trotsky for support. Trotsky had opposed this change, and he also turned to Trotsky for support on the Georgian question. And it was at this period where Lenin and Trotsky clearly were working together. Lenin was still concerned about the fragile state of his own health, and he felt that he had to depend upon Trotsky to prosecute the struggle against the growth of bureaucracy and the individual who he began more and more to identify as Georgia Morda, this social type, and he came to see Stalin as a danger. And that finds expression, of course, in the famous Testament, which Lenin writes in December, in which he evaluates all the leaders in the Politburo, and he, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, he makes different comments about them all, and we'll perhaps come back to that, and he makes comments about Lenin, about Stalin and Trotsky. But then in early January, he writes a codicil, which was very critical, clearly reflecting Lenin's ongoing thoughts about problems within the leadership. He says, Stalin is too rude. The party should find a way of removing him from power. There were a number of incidents which had sparked this, but Lenin was not a man who made casual judgments. When Lenin spoke about individuals, even when he spoke personally, he always did so within the framework of a political evaluation. If he said Stalin was too rude, this was not that he he blew his nose or he didn't show the necessary level of culture. He was talking about a form of impermissible behavior, which reflected the interests of different classes. And he says Stalin must be removed. A way has to be found. As Vadim later explains, and is well known, that testament was to be suppressed and never seen after Lenin's death. So much is bound up with this question of 1922-23. Vadim deals with it at great length and very carefully and very well. And he leaves no doubt as to two issues. One, that Lenin's death, first of all, the renewal of his illness in March of 1923 was a political disaster. To the extent that anyone was indispensable, it was Lenin. And he also establishes that in the consequence of Lenin's illness and subsequent death, and you asked a lot, you asked about psychological murder. I think there's some other issues you might want to ask before that too. Well, but it certainly created a situation where Trotsky was deprived of his most important support within the Bolshevik Party. It changed the dynamic completely in the leadership for reasons which have great political significance and which need to be further elaborated. But it changed everything and placed Trotsky in a extraordinarily difficult situation. Not the very fact that Lenin didn't just die. Lenin fell ill, at first losing all power of speech. He revived in the course of the year. But the very uncertainty about Lenin's condition as to whether he would or would not be able to resume political work, which persisted through much of 1923, intensified the difficulties facing Trotsky. I know that Vadim, and this is, he raises a number of times why Trotsky did not proceed. For example, Lenin had called upon him to prosecute the struggle against Stalin at the party congress, which was scheduled for April 1923. Why did he not do that after Lenin fell ill? I think that Lenin, in the environment. I mean, 1 month after Lenin had fallen ill, Trotsky was extremely concerned that he should not be seen as grasping for power. This was especially the case given the already fraught atmosphere within the political committee, the increasingly unprincipled character of the maneuvers against him, and Trotsky's decision. I mean, he was clearly also waiting to see what would happen with Lenin, but Trotsky's growing realization that the problems which he confronted in terms of his personal position were bound up with profound problems of the whole development of the revolution, which didn't lend themselves to simple answers. It wasn't just a question of what he had to do to save his position. You might say if Trotsky had one disadvantage, and I'm using this in a somewhat ironical term, Trotsky had the disadvantage of being able to understand in the most profound sense the implications of political actions. He would later say that there are actions which appear successful, but which lead to a dead end. There are policies which in the short term produce defeat, but they leave open the possibility of development and a perspective. Trotsky understood that the problems which were associated with his own, let's say, fall from power were bound up with powerful shifts in class relations, enormous problems arising from the unfavorable global world position of the Russian Revolution, its isolation, problems in its economic development, in the cultural development of Russia. And he was working the policies he advanced were aimed not so much at improving his tactical position as trying to work for a change in policy, even what might appear to be small changes, which would create more favorable conditions for the strengthening of the revolutionary tendency which he represented. I think that's often difficult to understand. And certainly bourgeois historians, they talk about the politics inside the Bolshevik Party as if it's the local ward of the Democratic Party, and people, the Democrats, these type of politicians we're familiar with are people who, they make it up as they go along. They don't see further than their own nose. They're ignorant tacticians of bankrupt politics. Trotsky was a historical political figure, and so he was always concerned with the relationship of the struggle within the party to much broader questions. It doesn't mean that he ignored tactics, and who doesn't make mistakes in the daily practice of political life. But I think none of the mistakes Trotsky is often accused of were consequential, were of a major significance in terms of the outcome of the struggle within the Bolshevik Party. Clearly, and Vadim documents this so powerfully, in Lenin's absence, he was dealing with a massive political conspiracy. And we'll go into that when we talk perhaps about Zinoviev and Kamenev. He was dealing with a massive political conspiracy in which real social forces were being moved against him. Social forces which were connected to the neo-capitalist policies of the post-1921 period, the decline in revolutionary elan within the Soviet Union, discouragement among the masses, and above all, defeats on the international front, particularly in Germany in 1923, which further isolated Trotsky and strengthened the right-wing conservative elements. Just to your last part of your question, there are two issues. The psychological murder. There were signs that Lenin was improving from the summer of 1923 on. There were increasingly optimistic reports. Lenin certainly from August of 1923 on was able to follow carefully political developments inside the party. He could not speak, but he could read. He had apparently full comprehension And he was becoming increasingly aware, particularly from October 1923 on, of the growing and public attack on Trotsky, which, from the testimony, particularly of Krupskaya, we know, caused him profound anxiety. There was a party conference which opened up in January 1924, and Pravda was full of vehement and virulent attacks on Trotsky, who, by the way, was ill himself, was suffering from some sort of malarial infection which would plague him. And Pravda was full of really bitter denunciations of Trotsky. Lenin was extremely distressed by this. And there are two things which is reported in Vadim's book. One is, which I hadn't known, in January, among the last requests Lenin made for reading were articles by Trotsky on problems of life. And in fact, one of those articles, he asked Krupskaya to reread it to him. Then we also know that it was in the immediate aftermath of reading, just really hours after reading Pravda's latest installment of virulent attacks, that Lenin suddenly suffered an extreme reversal, and apparently must have had another stroke and died within a few hours. I had read that initially, by the way. Roy Medvedev also said that, so it's not only Vadim who makes this point. Apparently that is well known. But Vadim refers to the psychological murder of Lenin, that is, the trauma produced by the terrible lowering of the political level of the Bolshevik Party and the disgusting factionalism of Zinoviev, Kamenev, the anti-Trotsky tirades that were taking place, which were full of falsifications. But then he raises another question, I think perhaps we'll come back to that later, and that is whether he was physically murdered. And Vadim presents evidence and brings together the different indications that that is a serious possibility. It certainly is a conclusion that Trotsky came to later in his life, at the very end of his life, that Stalin had in fact administered poison. He has a quote about Stalin in which Stalin is referred to, I think it was by Suvarin. He was a luminary of crime. And Stalin was a criminal, there's no question about it. I mean, he was a man who was driven by ambition. There was politics behind it, and we'll discuss that, but it's not possible not to consider that, knowing what Stalin was capable of, what he proved to himself to be capable of, to exclude the possibility that Lenin was murdered by Stalin, that Stalin used his access and control over Lenin physically, which he had, to administer poison.
I think one of the things that stands out, actually two things that stand out most to me on reading this book, is one, the degree of criminality of Stalinism at an early stage, how far advanced it was at such an early stage. Rogovin documents the rigging of elections, the publication of falsehoods, smear campaigns, dishonesty, stacking of appointments, etc. Very early on, 1922, 1923, seizing the opportunity presented by Lenin's ill health. And coupled with this, the second point is the really shocking role played by Zinoviev and Kamenev in this. Rogovin writes at one point that it is not enough to speak of the major errors of Zinoviev and Kamenev, but of their criminal guilt. And that stood out to me on reading this, the role that they played in this. We have a question from our audience that I think also can factor into this discussion. One of the audience members writes, can you speak about the role of subjective resentment embodied by Zinoviev and Kamenev during the struggle between the left opposition and the bureaucracy? And I think, and David, you can speak to this, I think that what Rogovin demonstrates is that it goes far beyond subjective resentment. Doubtless that is accurate, but it is more than that. And perhaps you could speak to this, the role of Zinoviev and Kamenev and the conspiracy of the Troika against Trotsky.
Well, I must I must state that when one reads this, it's in such a concentrated form presented by Vadim. Yes, the role of Zinoviev and Kamenev can truly be described as criminal. Without their thoroughly unprincipled behavior, their formation of an unprincipled clique relationship with Stalin, their efforts to do everything they could to undermine Trotsky, to legitimize lies, to create the myth of Trotskyism, as they refer to it, Stalin's rise to power would not have been possible. This is not, by the way, just when we speak about creating the myth of Trotskyism. They later admitted this to Trotsky. Later on, in 1925-26, when they themselves, as a result of their own unprincipled politics, found themselves edged out of power, and then later the unified opposition would be formed, they admitted frankly to Trotsky that they had engaged in a conspiracy to destroy him. So at one level, the subjectivism, there was an immense element of subjectivism. I think particularly in the case of Zinoviev. He had been something of Lenin's secretary prior to the revolution for a number of years. He had worked closely with Lenin in Switzerland. And the year 1917, however, proved to be his political, sort of revealed his limitations, revealed basic problems in his own political development as well as that of Kamenev. That is, both of them opposed the October insurrection. And no doubt they were at a subjective level extremely distressed by the fact that Trotsky, who had been a factional opponent of Lenin prior to 1917, but a factional opponent based on critical political questions, was suddenly elevated, again for profoundly significant political reasons, into the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, and was to become, next to Lenin, certainly the most important and critical and historic figure of the Russian Revolution. They were galled by this. But the point, I think, which has to be made, that in addition to this subjectivism, or I say perhaps related to this subjectivism, there was another political line at work. It is worth always reminding oneself about the time frame. You know, when one reads, I mean, the Russian Revolution is such a gigantic event that each year, 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920, and so on, appear like epochs. But it was still a very short period of time. The period between Trotsky's rise to power and, so to speak, the beginning of his fall, if we would put it in contemporary terms, it's like from 2015 to today. Not a very long time. In 1917, there was a fundamental shift in the policy of the Bolshevik Party. They shifted from a party which advanced the perspective of what was known as the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, that is, a regime which did not transfer power to the working class. It was not conceived of as a socialist government. It was, as they later said, somewhat of an algebraic or somewhat abstract formulation which left unclear the precise class nature of the new state, to the perspective of permanent revolution, which was very clearly directed toward the conquest of power by the working class in Russia as part of the world revolution. Lenin shifted to that in 1917. Under the antecedent influence of the war, the implications of World War I, his reevaluation of political conditions within Russia as a consequence of the global crisis. And it was that coming together of perspectives that accounted for Trotsky's rise within the Bolshevik Party. But because, as is often the case in politics, these divisions, these lines of division were not settled. There remained, in my view, a tendency within the Bolshevik Party which never really accepted the theory of permanent revolution, which continued to see Trotsky not just as a sort of competitor, but as the representative of a political tendency with which they were not in agreement. And that underlay the explosive reemergence of factional fighting directed against Trotsky once Lenin was no longer in a position to contain that and to suppress that. One further point in relationship to that, which I think needs to be made, that Vadim discusses the Testament. When he speaks of the weaknesses, he says, well, the weaknesses of Zinoviev and Kamenev should not be held against them personally. But he goes on to say they were not accidental. In other words, he understood that the opposition of Zinoviev and Kamenev to the overthrow of the provisional government in October was based on the fact that they really still retained adherence to the pre-April 1917 position. Stalin also, by the way, it must be stressed, and when the revolution broke out, he too still advanced the old position and was in fact in support of continuing the war and supported the provisional government. So these divisions, there were political divisions which were to reemerge and underlay the extraordinary bitterness of Zinoviev and Kamenev toward Trotsky. I mean, they dealt with him as a political enemy. Of course, as you read this, and it is chilling, as you read this, knowing what was to happen, they were to pay, both of them were to pay with their lives for this. I mean, Stalin murdered both of them. And as tragic as their fate was, it is an object lesson as to the consequence of subjective politics. The subordination of issues of political principle to ambition, to petty strivings for position, conducting politics in a manner which seeks not to clarify but relies on slander and so on. That's what they were guilty of, and they created conditions which led to their own destruction.
Just on that last point, David, there's an account in the book. It's a citation from Stalin's secretary who had been recording interactions. It's from 1927, after Kamenev and Zinoviev, who had formed an opposition with Trotsky in 1926. They then abandoned that and returned into the party in 27, although the history from there is complicated. But nonetheless, Stalin's secretary relates a discussion between Stalin and Zinoviev in which Zinoviev is sort of appealing to Stalin, and he says, "Does Comrade Stalin know what gratitude is?" Replies, "Yes, it's an illness that afflicts dogs." I found that to be incredibly chilling, as you say, but also really representative of the political breakdown, the cultural breakdown that Stalin represented. It just sort of erupts to the surface, and I think that this book is very compelling is because Rogovin brings forward this real life history of how such a political conflict unfolded. Just to maybe turn the discussion a little bit, 29 and 30, Rogovin discusses international developments, such as the failed revolutions in Germany in 23, the situation in the Comintern as the war on Trotsky is accelerating. He actually He has a quote from, I believe it's the same French communist that you just mentioned, Souvarine, who at meetings was objecting to the treatment of Trotsky. And he is speaking about this situation, I believe, inside his own political party and in the Comintern parties in general. And he says, Trotsky is dissolving in ignorance and fear, but no one understands the goals of the campaign. And I think it's very interesting because it seemed to point to the incredible political disorientation that must have been affecting not just the Communist Party inside the Soviet Union, but the entire Comintern. With sort of what would the consequences of that be? Maybe you could speak a little bit about the impact of Stalinism on the Comintern.
Well, obviously, this is a vast subject. There was not a party in the Third International that had the background, experience, the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. That party had developed, and this, in a sense, was the unique character of the Bolshevik Party created by Lenin. It had carried out a struggle over, if one takes 1903 as a critical turning point, the initial break with Menshevism, had a long history of the most intense political struggle against different forms of opportunism, bourgeois, petty bourgeois ideologies. It had gone through the experience of the revolution of 1905, the post-1905 period of political reaction. It was the one party which really stood out in defining the world implications of World War I. And of course, we're speaking of Lenin's work above all. It is in the beginning of World War I that Lenin emerges as, you might say, a world historical figure. He draws the line internationally and explains the significance of the struggle between opportunism and Marxism. And he trained his cadre on this basis. So they had this combination of a movement which had gone through a vast range of political experiences, enormous theoretical depth, the unparalleled experience of the Russian Revolution itself and the Civil War. The other parties were formed largely under conditions of the consequences of the Russian Revolution, the break that the revolution brought about, the split between within the existing parties of the Second International between opportunist and revolutionary tendencies. The one party, you might say, which in one country in which there was a more developed, certainly a more developed movement in Germany, there too, this revolutionary elements were isolated. Social democracy remained the principal mass party, but most tragic of all, the two dominant figures in German communism, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and others such as Leo Jogisch, were murdered in 1919 by the Freikorps, with the approval of social democracy. So the communist parties, and to that we could add the American Communist Party, which was formed in 1919, were far less experienced and depended enormously upon the leadership of the Russian Communist Party. Now, what that meant during the first four Congresses was not a bureaucratic leadership dictating to the young communist parties, but the Communist International was conceived to some extent as what Trotsky called a school of revolutionary strategy. It would be a means by which a world movement could be built, drawing upon the experiences of the working class on a global scale, of course, drawing upon the immense experience of the Russian Revolution. But it was never from the standpoint that the Russians would dictate policy. The Soviet regime under Stalin more and more utilized the resources which it had at its disposal to corrupt the Communist International, to buy leaders, to utilize also disorientation, the fact that they didn't really understand, in many cases, what the divisions were about. You must keep in mind that it really wasn't until 1928 that the American communists even were able to, read for the first time in a clear form, a summing up of the antecedent struggle in the Communist Party. So I think that was a major factor. They were inexperienced, in many cases unformed. They were still in a process of formation, and I think that's a big factor in the Stalinization. By the way, a process begun under Zinoviev. It was Zinoviev who began manipulating and removing those who they identified as potential supporters of Trotsky. And this process was to have catastrophic consequences within the Communist International itself. Wherever it was, including, by the way, later on, the Chinese Communist Party, whose leadership initially, particularly among students in the Soviet Union, or Chinese students, were overwhelmingly pro-Trotsky. But it was an unhealthy environment made worse by the unprincipled maneuvers of the bureaucracy. Discussion was poisoned.
I agree. Clearly we already see here the apparatus of Stalinism being deployed, not just within the Soviet Union, but internationally. And we have a quote quite chilling by a member of the Central Committee of the Polish Communist Party, when Stalin and the triumvirate were attempting to rig the membership because they had expressed sympathy for Trotskyism. One of the members of the Central Committee said, "Comrade Zinoviev informed us long ago, we will break your bones if you try to speak against us." This sort of language of brutality and violence, of the rigging of central committees, etc., became the export of Stalinism. And all of the mechanisms that were perfected in the struggle against Trotsky and the left opposition by Stalinism were exported as well. I'd like to turn to what I see as a critical theme for Rogovin in this book, which is the question of equality. It's clear that the question of equality, of social equality in the Soviet Union, of the bureaucracy, as to use Trotsky's words, the gendarme of inequality, that this is a critical theme, that one of the functions of the bureaucracy and the apparatus that Stalin is expanding and creating is the defense of privileges. And I think a discussion of this would help understand what's going on a good deal.
Oh, I'm glad. Well, this you're right. This is an absolutely critical and central element of Vadim's analysis, and I think really a major contribution and development. Of course, it is present. Trotsky writes about it at great length. It's fundamental to his analysis of the Soviet Union, the decay of the Soviet state. He defined the bureaucracy, as you've just said, as the gendarme, the policeman of inequality. Trotsky explained how the gendarme of inequality, the bureaucracy arose out of generalized want. There's a famous passage quoted by Trotsky from Marx, in which Marx says, "Where there is want, there will be a gendarme to enforce the unequal distribution of goods, and all the old filth will arise." Again. Now, it doesn't mean that they were living in the lap of luxury, but the fact is, as Trotsky says, when you have want and somebody is in charge of distributing, doling out the portions, that individual or that group will always make sure that there's enough for them, and maybe a bit more. So it was an objective function. It's not, Trotsky didn't deal with it as from the standpoint that this was a conspiracy. There was a certain objective process socially determined out of which this arose, but one in which, over time, found ever more conscious expression. Access to bureaucratic positions meant privilege. something more than other people received. Even some level of comfort in a society where there was very little comfort. Conditions for the working class were appalling and the source of a great deal of growing popular discontent, which played a major role in the development of the left opposition. The left opposition gave conscious expression, or sought to give very conscious expression, and a revolutionary expression to those legitimate feelings. But what Vadim does is he very clearly, and with increasing force as the volumes go on, demonstrates how the striving for privilege, Stalin's own desire for privilege, wealth, becomes a real factor in the hatred of Trotsky, it was bound up with Vadim's own very. Throughout in his sociological work, and I know that Andrea is very, very familiar and has written very well and studied Vadim's writings. Vadim made his reputation in Soviet academic circles in the 1970s and 1980s as the foremost sociologist of inequality in the USSR. He demonstrated that the Soviet Union was not an equal society. It was a society with a nomenclatura, with privilege, and he pursued this theme in, I believe, he had an astonishing curricula vitae of over 200 articles. As a sociologist, he was immensely prolific. And the question of equality was one which was of profound concern to him. And his definition of socialism, he said, what was the one word which defined socialism? It was equality. Socialism is incompatible with any form of inequality, the oppression of one segment of society over another. We had many discussions on this issue, and it was one which motivated a great deal of his work. Trotsky himself had once said that if you had to ask yourself, determine is a society progressing or is it moving backwards? Well, a progressive society is one which is realizing ever greater levels of equality. A society which is regressing is one in which inequality becomes more and more dominant. Well, we know what stage we are living in every capitalist country in the world today. The staggering levels of inequality which exist within the United States and Europe testify to the profound degeneration of capitalist society. And it finds perhaps its most brutal expression in the open declaration that death doesn't matter. People die, that's the way it is. Why complain? All decisions are based on how it will increase the wealth of a very small privileged elite. Vadim was immensely sensitive to that. I also want to say that he wasn't, however, as a personality, some sort of aesthetic. He was a man who enjoyed life, but he believed profoundly, I wouldn't say but, he saw that the true enjoyment of life will come when there is no deprivation, there is no poverty, there is no suffering, that people live in a society where all people can realize the greatest, to the fullest extent, their abilities, their talents, and poverty and inequality will be looked upon as barbarisms of a less enlightened age.
Just following up a little bit, David, on this question of Vadim's study of equality and his understanding of it. Actually, it was during the mid-1980s, before he could write openly about Trotsky and Trotskyism, that he began to enter into a very public debate in opposition to the growth and the defense of social inequality. It was on the pages of major press. He was actually in a kind of a political, intellectual conflict with some of the leading figures, scholars at the time, including woman who was also a sociologist, who was one of the architects of perestroika.
Zatslatskaya.
And he was actually, in 1985, there was an internal discussion at the institute where he worked, which had written an analysis of the growth of social inequality. He uses the term unjustified inequality. And he's criticized and told, in principle, there can be no such thing. Told, you had better be careful what you're saying because this is going to the highest levels. He had been very concerned with this question for a long time, and really, I would say, sticking his neck out on it as much as he possibly could within the limits of the reality that he faced. And I would want to tell the reader that the discussion of privileges and how the bureaucracy was maneuvering to get privileges for itself is a very interesting part of the book. Notes, for instance, the time period when this term nomenclatura, the sort of the named elite, emerged all of a sudden. So you really can learn a lot about this from the book. Shifting the discussion a little bit, in addition to this question of equality, one of the major points, dividing lines between Trotsky and Stalin, and Rogovin addresses this, is the question of socialism in one country. Could socialism really be built in one country? What were the implications of that? What was the opposing perspective of Scalice, and really the opposing perspective of the Bolshevik Party prior to the rise of Stalin? So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, that is, it's again, when one thinks, understands the evolution, the political evolution of the conflict, and one doesn't just see it, though the personal elements are immensely important, politics does move through people. But there was a certain logic. It's often the case in political conflicts that initially, if they take a personal form, it takes some time until the issues which underlie the conflict come to the fore. That is, the class questions, the broader issues of perspective. That's also important to understand when one poses the question, why didn't Trotsky immediately take this or that action to counteract the maneuvers against him? In late 1924, Stalin and Bukharin work out for the first time a position which says, and this was contradicting anything that had ever been said in the Bolshevik Party before, but that socialism can be built in one country, that Russia by itself could reorganize its economy and realize socialism. Now, not only was this obviously a rejection of the internationalism of the Russian Revolution, it was, if I can use the term, an ABC of Marxism, that a backward country such as Russia did not have the resources to create a socialist society which assumed a higher level of industrial economic development and thereby a higher standard of living than those that existed in capitalist countries. Why the working class came to power in a backward country was bound up not with the inherent potential of Russia for a self-sufficient socialism, but the global contradictions of the capitalist system, the so-called chain of world capitalism, breaking at its weakest link. The working class could come to power in a backward country, but the development of socialism depended ultimately upon the support given to that revolution from outside. The overthrow of capitalism in the more advanced countries, and thereby allowing the backward country to draw upon the more advanced resources of the highly developed capitalist countries. In 1924, though, when finally you could say that with the articulation of this perspective, the underlying issues of the divisions within the Bolshevik Party, with all the factionalism, the subjectivism, became very clear. In a fundamental sense, even if one takes the growth of Stalinism as a whole and its murderous character. It was, I think it's best understood, as a vicious nationalist reaction against the internationalism of the Russian Revolution, a vicious nationalist reaction which found a social base within a bureaucracy and bureaucratized elements, or an increasingly bureaucracy within both the state and the party, which saw the state, which emerged out of the October Revolution, as a means, as a provider of privilege. The state, their control of the state, its control of the state, the bureaucracy's control of the state, was a source of personal enrichment. That was the sort of the connection between the nationalism of the Stalinist perspective and the material interests of the bureaucracy. Its opposition to the theory of permanent revolution. Trotsky said it very well, the hatred of the theory of permanent revolution. Why did the average bureaucrat hate the permanent revolution? You would think, well, not everything for the world revolution, something for me. Even more vulgarly, oh, there's Trotsky with his permanent revolution. When they were concentrated on the here or now, what they could get, could they get a better apartment? Could they get extra rations? Could they get access to beef? Maybe vacations down in, the Caucasus, whatever it was. And Stalin, the provider of privileges, the man who controlled the bureaucracy and the different and access to these forms of privilege, became the voice, the mouthpiece of this vile nationalist reaction, which became an ever more dominant theme of the Soviet leadership and its, policies. But now just on this question itself, because it's often misrepresented that Trotsky had the position that, permanent revolution means everyone takes power at once. No, obviously that wasn't the case. And Trotsky, in fact, in his writings, presented the most realistic appraisal how the Soviet Union should conduct itself under conditions in which the timetable of world revolution, the timetable of revolution in the advanced countries, could be of a longer span than had been initially anticipated. That capitalism, certainly following the defeat in Germany, had a certain period of stabilization. Trotsky was very sensitive and very acute in his evaluation of these different shifts in the world situation. Trotsky was one who actually favored very strongly obtaining access to the resources of the world economy, particularly access to industry. He was not in favor of what became known as import substitution, reinventing the wheel. The Soviet Union needed advanced equipment, and so he advanced policies in which he argued that the development of Soviet agriculture could itself provide the surplus which was needed in order to buy essential Western industrial goods, to facilitate and accelerate Soviet industrial development, while they sought and worked for, through the Communist International, a revolutionary overturn in the advanced countries. So Trotsky had a very, very advanced policy, and one which, by the way, remained entirely vital into the 1980s and would have been the alternative to the policy of Gorbachev.
I agree. These questions do not go away. They are sharpened throughout the history of the Soviet Union. It is, as you characterize it, the vicious nationalism of Stalinism, or Stalinism as vicious nationalism, that to an extent gives it its global portability. It appeals to social layers in countries of belated capitalist development that use the nationalism of Stalinism as a means of achieving their ends. And the apparatus that has been created and the mechanisms of Stalinism, so carefully documented in this book, are the toolkit of Stalinist parties around the globe in betraying struggles of the working class. My own scholarship deals with the history of the Communist Party of the Philippines, and I documented the way in which they mobilized mass support behind Rodrigo Duterte, a fascistic thug. And when I documented this, they slandered me in a Stalinist fashion. They threatened me, etc. This is not an aberration. This is the nature of Stalinism. And I'd like to raise in that sense a contemporary topic for discussion that comes from our audience members. The Democratic Socialists of America, leaders of them on Twitter and so on, have routinely taken to using ice pick memes, to referencing attacks on Trotsky, etc., as a sort of joking consolidation of their politics. It is a very vicious, ugly, violent threat. And in that context, we have this question from an audience member who asks, what is the significance today of publications like Jacobin magazine writing favorably of the role of Stalinism in the 1930s, notably about Dolores Ibarruri? So what is it about Stalinism that we see emerging in the 1920s that continues to appeal to certain social layers? Stalin has been exposed.
I want to say, that those who put up ice picks or who legitimize the crime of Stalinism are political criminals. They're no better, and essentially in their outlook no different than those who legitimize the Holocaust. The Holocaust, after all, and the Moscow trials are profoundly interrelated events. It was one thing, however tragic, for Stalinists of the 1930s, workers who were disoriented by Stalinism to believe, or to be disoriented by the lies. I mean, there's no confusion today as to what Stalin was and what he did. He was a political criminal, a mass murderer. He annihilated the Bolshevik Party. He murdered socialists all over the world. He murdered, he will go down in history as one of them, as among the most despicable people who ever lived. And one can only conclude with all the information at their disposal, those who defend Stalinism and defend Stalin, if they're not mentally deranged, do so because they feel sympathy for his politics. They are, in the most fundamental sense, they're anti-revolutionary. They hate the working class. They hate socialism. And after all, what was the political essence of Stalinism? It wasn't just a system of crimes. The crimes were the means by which certain policies were realized. And what were those policies? The policies of popular front. The policy of subordinating the working class to capitalism. You mentioned Duterte, he's a bourgeois politician. The Philippine Communist Party seeks to subordinate the working class and the peasantry to the bourgeois state. The Jacobin, which you referred to, that's an organ of the Democratic Party. It despises the Trotskyist movement and the World Socialist website, the Socialist Equality Party, because we fight for the political independence of the working class. We seek to break the working class from bourgeois politics. And those who promote such a reactionary politics are drawn to Stalin and to Stalinism. I mean, they view the period of the Popular Front as sort of an apotheosis. Trotsky defined the Popular Front as the alliance of the GPU, the Soviet secret police, and the bourgeois liberals. That's what it was. And remember, in the United States, large sections of bourgeois liberals, magazines such as The Wretched Nation, which exists to this day, were enthusiastic supporters of the Moscow trials. They believed all the lies. So, yes, Stalinism is a pathology. I've observed it very often, and on a very visceral level. People who are drawn to Stalinism and who admire his crimes, they are sort of pathologically hostile to socialism. They tend to be culturally extremely backward, uninterested in theoretical questions, contemptuous of history, and there's no shortage of bourgeois historians who share that. I mean, the number of admiring biographies of Stalin that have appeared in the last 20 years is really astonishing. He's something of a hero in bourgeois circles. And ultimately, because they can understand Stalin. It's much easier to write about a mafia crime figure than it is to write about a political figure who works at a very advanced level of theory. You know, the criminal thinks like them. They understand his motivations. Trotsky once said, very appropriately, not every petty bourgeois can be a Hitler, but there's a little bit of Hitler in every petty bourgeois. Not every petty bourgeois radical can be a Stalin, but there's a little bit of Stalin in every petty bourgeois radical. And if you look at the type of politics which exists in the universities, which has no shortage of petty bourgeois radicals or pseudo-radicals in their faculty, you know, they conduct themselves. They have the same characteristics: lying, deceit. And there's one other point, because I know we're coming to the end of the program, I would like to speak about, and one fundamental theme of the book. If you read, it's the staggeringly reactionary role of historical falsification. And I must say, the first agreement that Vadim and I had was that we would launch our campaign for historical truth in opposition to the post-Soviet school of historical falsification. Where do the lies lead to? Mass murder, the most catastrophic defeats of the working class, fascism. And I think that there are profound lessons in our own time. As many of you know, I'm speaking out of the audience, the Socialist Equality Party of the United States, World Socialist website, has been engaged in a struggle against the falsification of another revolution in world history, the American Revolution and the Civil War. Lies are being told about this revolution. An attempt is being made to discredit it, to declare that it was of no consequence, that the founding of the United States on the basis of a great bourgeois revolution was in fact a counter-revolution. The Declaration of Independence is to be looked upon with contempt. And in the context of Vadim Rogovin, I know, because we discussed this, Vadim was a great admirer of the American Revolution. For him, Jefferson's great statement, "All men are created equal," marks an epoch in the development of human thought. And he would often note that Trotsky himself wanted to write a book about the Civil War, the American Civil War, because he saw so many parallels between the Russian Civil War and the American Civil War. But those who pour contempt on the American Revolution and who use lies and falsifications and slander significant historians active today, such as Gordon Wood, James McPherson, and others, and try to impose upon history their own narrow-minded, subjective, ill-informed moralizing, that the people of the 18th century couldn't wave a magic wand and solve the problem of slavery, which, by the way, has not even been solved in the 21st century. They display and they resort to such falsification. They never consider, or they seem to be completely indifferent to the consequences of such falsifications. We are facing right now the danger of fascism in the United States. You would have to be blind not to realize that what took place on January 6, 2021, just about 10 months ago, was an attempted fascistic coup in the United States. To Trump and his cohorts, for them, Mein Kampf is their Bible. They wake up every morning and they ask themselves, what would the Führer do? And they draw lessons from it. And those who pour contempt on the revolution, the Civil War, with all their contradictions, and undermine any sense of revolutionary consciousness or any deep feeling for the importance of the defense of these conquests, and belittle fundamental democratic principles and sanction lies and distortions and falsifications, they're playing a horrible role, and they should look to the example of what happens when lies are told. We already know from recent history in the United States, weapons of mass destruction, that was the lie that gave us the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who have died. And the ongoing pandemic, which has been a long trail of one lie after another. It will go away. Herd immunity. Children can't get infected. And so on. Lies have consequences. And those who tolerate lies and spread them themselves, whatever their excuses, are creating the intellectual environment for counter-revolution, for fascism. Well, that's not going to happen because Vadim was inspired, the Trotskyist movement is inspired by the belief that truth is more powerful than lies. And objective conditions are leading to a great reawakening of the working class. We are witnessing, finally, a great renewal of class struggle. Class struggle cleanses the environment. It cleans the air. If reaction closes up the mind, or as Trotsky said, during periods of reaction, ignorance bears its fangs. In period of the upsurge of the class struggle, thought takes wing. And I'd like to believe that the publication of this book, the reading of this book, a new familiarity with the history of the Russian Revolution, and of course the great works of Trotsky, will prove decisive in providing the orientation which we all need, which the working class needs in this period. So I'm very, very proud. I must say, speaking for the SEP and from my own experience, I'm proud to have known Vadim Rogovin. I think of him all the time, and I'm sure he would be immensely heartened and enthusiastic to see this new period and to recognize that the conditions now exist for the realization of all his great aspirations for socialism and human equality.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap this up. Your final remarks, David, are very much in the spirit of Rogovin, of this book. They are passionate, they are powerful, and they are convinced of the existence of objective historical truth. And it is that concept that underpins this book, that even despite the horrible developments in the rise of Stalinism and so on, this book nonetheless is a document of hope, because it is a document that exposes the lies of historical falsification and presents the perspective of historical truth and the need for a revolutionary alternative to the nationalist betrayals of Stalinism. I want to encourage all of our viewers, take advantage of the current discount, avail yourself of it, purchase this book. Was there an alternative? 1923 to 1927, Trotskyism, a look back through the years, by Vadim Rogovin. While you're at Mering.com, where you can pick up this volume, you can also purchase the other works of Rogovin in English for a similar discount. It's a terrific deal, and these are amazing works. No Marxist library.
If I can just conclude on one more point, we should read, but read to fight. Contact the Socialist Equality Party here in the United States, or in the countries where it's active. Get involved. Reading is for fighting. If you want to have socialism, you have to fight for it. It won't be given to you. Anyway, thank you very much, Andrea and Joe. It was great talking to you, and I want to again, I hope that all the listeners have found this a useful and important discussion. Thank you very much.